There's nothing that happens after the Haitian Revolution in our fight for freedom across the Caribbean and North South America that wasn't influenced by the Haitian Revolution.
The African people on the island fought all the largest armies of the world at the time and won over each one of them. Whooped the Spaniards, beat up the French, knocked down the British.
The Haitians have a pride about them. The revolution is the most important thing to them. The first thing they instill in you is that you are the first Black Republic.
1804 becomes important because it's the date at which the implementation of the dream of real revolution and real equality and new nation status and the ability to defend your new nation is manifest.
When you look at modern historians, when they talk about victories that Europeans had over non-white people, they always frame the narrative as victories. But when African people rise up and fight off their European oppressors, they frame the narrative as a massacre.
Africans everywhere that were enslaved resisted it. Haiti becomes significant because it was the first time in human history that an enslaved population actually overthrew their oppressors.
The Haitian Revolution, though, was the most organized, the most large scale, the most impressive in terms of structure and complication from the very beginning.
Haiti made more money for France than all 13 colonies.
The Haitian Revolution was very influential, particularly amongst Africans. It was seen as an inspiration for Africans in this hemisphere, just as it was seen as a horror by those who held slavery dear.
There is a concept that we must defeat Haiti. We must ground them into the ground. We can never let them rise. They are an example of Black power. They are an example of what happens when people who are oppressed decide to stop being oppressed.
The island of Hispaniola is one of the oldest islands in the Western Hemisphere. The island is very strategic because it has a lot of natural resources, it has a lot of precious metals, and a lot of the European powers were scrambling to get control of that area.
Haiti is the first place that Christopher Columbus did a fort, did a settlement. So it's the first settlement in the Americas.
Christopher Columbus on the west coast of Africa in 1482. He's involved with Africans on the west coast. That is how he came to America in the first place. It was they who told him there was land to the west. In fact, in his journals, he says that he met Africans going back to Africa when he was on his way to America.
What folks are doing these days shows that there were Africans on that island when Columbus got there. At least 3 different types. There were the Caracoles up in the north, Guanini, and there's another one. But you can find that in the book called The Annals of Haiti.
The Spanish declared this was for them, but the French says, what do you mean this is for you? And the British said, well, how could you have it all? So right from the beginning, we had colonial wars among them on the island.
When you're dealing with the Spaniards, you're looking at the introduction of Africans in 1503. When you're looking at the introduction of Africans from the French, you're looking at 1670. So you're looking at a wide gap between the Spaniards and the French bringing Africans onto this island. But what happened on that island was that they brought a culture that was deeply steeped in what is probably the most important liberating force that any human can have, and that is in spirituality.
1675, the Treaty of Ryswick, the church established that the island would be split in 2. One side would be for the Spaniards, and the other side would be for the French. So at that point, what the Spaniards had named the island, I told you, was already Haiti. That's the original name of the island. Now, the Spaniards named the island Hispaniola. And when they agreed to share it with French, the French called their side Saint-Domingue, and the Spaniards kept Hispaniola for theirs, but called the capital city Santo Domingo, which is still Saint-Domingue.
When the Spanish got here in 1492, and you know, they're on the island from 1492 to 1625, The Spanish is looking for gold. They're looking for wealth, and this is the first thing they started doing. And they find some gold. Haiti still produces gold today. And so gold was the big prize that everybody's looking for. But once they get into sugarcane was sweet gold. I mean, sugarcane was it.
During the period where they were commencing this genocide against the indigenous population, a priest called Bartholomew de las Casas came up with this idea that it was ungodly to do what they were doing to the indigenous people of Hispaniola. They were killing them off. It was terrible, which it was, incredibly brutal. So they needed someone else to do it to. And this was where he came up with the idea of getting people from elsewhere.
This revolution was going on from the moment Africans touched the shores. That's very important to understand, because what also happened is that when Africans were brought to this island, many of the warriors from the Congo, from Yoruba, or what we call Nigeria, or from Ghana, when they were brought here, the Ashanti, they immediately escaped and created maroon towns. These maroon towns would later become the actual hubs of the revolutions, because many of them never really experienced being enslaved. The great majority of sugar that was consumed in Europe came from that part of the world, came from that island. The coffee that went to Europe came from that island.
That colony that the Spanish founded, taken by the French, eventually became the most profitable colony in the Americas, and arguably, depending on which economist you consult, the most profitable colony in the world at the time. It became the centerpiece of the transatlantic slave system. It became what gave France its supremacy over Britain in the 18th century. I mean, this island, it's impossible to overstate the economic importance of the island in the period we're talking about. It produced more profit than all of North America combined.
This was a wealth that was largely born by sugar, which was not only an item used to sweeten your tea and coffee, but it was also a marker of class. It was seen as a sign of sophistication when one used sugar. And in certain circles, it was even seen as a miracle drug of some sorts. And that helped to generate tremendous amounts of wealth on the island of Hispaniola, which is one of the reasons why the French, ultimately backed by the United States, fought so fiercely to retain that island.
I mean, the life expectancy in Jamaica or Haiti, for example, was often between 3 and 7 years. So once you arrived on the island, you were worked to death on average between 3 and 7 years. I mean, it's a genocide. And so that was what contributed, the type of torture. Because the white population was so much smaller than, say, on mainland America, vis-a-vis the black population, the paranoia was worse. And therefore the types of punishment, the types of torture, the extremity of the slave regime was much more severe in the Caribbean.
Taking pregnant women, crucify them, split their belly open enough so they will have a game. People are gonna bet who's gonna die first, the baby or the mother.
The reason why there was more rebellions in Jamaica and in the Caribbean in general is a number of factors. One, conditions were much worse. And I don't say that in any way to denigrate or downplay how brutal conditions were in America, but we can see this from the fact that the slavery was so bad in the Caribbean that the populations were not even able to reproduce themselves. So constantly new populations had to be brought from Africa.
And one of the things they used to do is bury us alive on an anthill, leaving your head so that you would slowly get tortured to death by ants eating your skull.
First of all, let's be clear, the rebellions against slavery started in Africa. And the rebellions against slavery in Africa are probably the most under-discussed and underrepresented element of the whole history. Everyone tells you that Africans collaborated, which is true. What they don't tell you about is those Africans that rebelled. And in fact, scholars estimate now, that it has been studied thoroughly, that the rebellions in Africa alone, of which there were hundreds, prevented perhaps 1 million people from crossing the Atlantic.
And one of the ways the planters kept control of Haiti was either to rape or have a child with a black woman, and then send that child to Europe to be educated, and then bring them back, and they became the overseers.
But all Africans that were enslaved understood that their natural state of being human was to be free and African. Those two things always went together.
In the Caribbean, because there was a concentration of sugar plantations, which was the most brutal form of slavery, worse than cotton or indigo or coffee or tobacco, it was the most labor intensive. And also the number of Africans versus the number of Europeans was much higher in the Caribbean. And then you have, of course, terrain. So island like Jamaica, island like Haiti, very mountainous, lend themselves to guerrilla warfare. Then you have strange political coincidences. So like during the years preceding the Haitian Revolution, there was a civil war in Africa in the Congo. So a lot of the Africans, Congolese, that ended up being Maroons in Haiti were African war veterans. They were militarily trained personnel back in Africa.
With the Haitian Revolution, there were 4 principal players in regards to the leadership of the Haitian Revolution. The first one was Mackandal.
Mackandal is considered to be the precursor to the 1791 beginning, because Mackandal was an enslaved African who worked at a plantation, and then he died in 1757 or 1758, but he freed himself. Right? Some people say that, you know, he had lost one arm in a sugar mill accident. But essentially, the legend of Mackandal is interesting because he foretold what would happen with regards to the Haitian Revolution.
He was this extraordinary herbalist. And what he did, he taught the people of Haiti, the Africans, how to use the herbs and fauna in the ecology that they're now in to poison the food of the white farmers. And he was very successful.
And so Mackandal went, took to the hills, and he would teach the kitchen people how to poison their masters.
They had nature on their side, and that's very important. They used nature as one of their greatest weapons. They knew the terrain, they understood the terrain, they understood botany, they understood toxicology, they understood poisons, they understood, and that's what Voodoo is. Voodoo is a science. Voodoo is not just a spiritual system.
The Bafiote means the black collaborators. They had to get them out of their face first. Mackandal, what he's really known, a lot of what he went after them first. Before he poisoned the European, he poisoned the black collaborators. No, they were all in the house Negroes, come on.
And one thing about Mackandal, he realized this. He understood that the black collaborators, we call them coons today, how they will sabotage black progress in order to get individual trinkets. So Mackandal, he saw that early on. So when it came to poisoning the white supremacists, Mackandal, he understood that we gotta get rid of these collaborators first. So he poisoned many of the black collaborators before he started to poison the white slave owners.
If you look at the statutes, the laws of a place like Georgia in the 1750s, contemporaneous with that revolt on Hispaniola, you'll find laws that are specifically seeking to restrain Africans from getting knowledge of plants because it was feared that they had in mind a plot or a conspiracy similar to what unfolded in what is now Haiti in the 1750s.
See, African people used strategies that they knew would work. Mackandal, another great revolutionary, he poisoned the French. And the women were the ones that poisoned them when they would prepare foods. He killed over 6,000 European Frenchmen.
When the enslaved Africans were finished with their work, he went down to talk to them. Like he would always go down and talk to them. And at one night, he took out 3 handkerchiefs. A yellow handkerchief, a white handkerchief, and a black handkerchief. And he said to the audience, in terms of storytelling, because that's how we give information through stories. So he took out the first handkerchief, and he said to the enslaved Africans, first handkerchief was yellow. He says, these are the people that owned this island before Columbus came. And they were totally annihilated. Then he took out the white. He says, the white handkerchief, these are the folks that, annihilated the Tainos. And then he took out the black handkerchief, and this is the prophecy. He says, we, Africans, are going to avenge the Taino folks, and we're going to get these white folks out of Haiti.
And so Mackandal used his science, and I think he was a kind of pharmacologist in modern terms, but he used his science of understanding the natural world to begin to talk about how do we take that knowledge and free ourselves. And Mackandal, he's sort of the spark of the Haitian Revolution.
When you look at many of the people coming up out of this system, for instance, Mackandal was a preacher. And Mackandal was a preacher who told his people and the people around him that he had visions. There's such a connection between Mackandal and Nat Turner as it relates to the work that they were doing.
Mackandal understood the problem with the collaborators, and unfortunately, it was a black collaborator who turned Mackandal in, who turned on him. And the French captured Mackandal, and they were going to burn him alive. When Mackandal was about to die, he made a very strange prediction. Mackandal said, "I'm coming back as a mosquito." Now, a lot of people didn't know what that meant. Years later, when the French came to invade the island, there was a certain number of French troops, thousands of them, who were killed by malaria brought on by mosquitoes. Now, the malaria skipped over the Africans because they were immune to the malaria. But the Mackandal prediction definitely came true. That just showed how spiritually in touch they were.
The next Haitian leader who was instrumental in the Haitian Revolution was a voodoo priest from Jamaica named Duddy Bookman.
So Bookman appears to be one of these persons who's leading resistance in Jamaica. The British, not wanting to martyr him, sells him to the French in Haiti, because the French is known for breaking black folks. Jamaica was supposed to be the place where that was done, but the French is supposed to be really strategic at this and good at this.
Bookman is the child of a woman whose name I don't have yet, who was a big-time revolutionary in Jamaica. And her son was sold to Saint-Domingue as punishment to the mother. So he was about 13, 14 when he was sold over here. And they seem to have been Muslims. He talks a lot about the Quran. And in fact, he's named Bookman because he had a small Quran tied to his waist. And at some point they realized that. And when he refused to give it to the colonizers and slavers, they burnt the book on him, with him. So he was all burnt up. And then to mock him, named him Bookman.
Bookman and another enslaved African woman named Cecilia Fatima began the planning stages of the revolution. They went around the island and they organized a Congress to participate in the infamous Bois Cayman voodoo ceremony that occurred in an alligator swamp.
Cecile Fatima had gone around for about 4 years to bring that Congress together. She had gone around the whole entire island to bring that Congress together.
And as much as many people talk about that meeting in the alligator swamp, that Bookman called for the prayer, but it wasn't Bookman that called that congregation together. And it wasn't done in an instant. It was months of organizing and building up. And the person who was leading this organization was a Mambo, a female priestess by the name of Cecilia Fatima.
It should not be seen as surprising that some of the leading figures of the revolutionary process were said to be either believers or practitioners of this New World belief system that we refer to as Vodun or Voodoo.
I like to share with my students. Think about what master you must have if you decide to hold your meeting in a swamp of alligators.
This kind of going so far as to take the life of your oppressor is already there. And the place where that meeting took place, the alligator swamp, that was a place the whites didn't go in because there were really alligators up in there. So very few people could go in and come out. But the black folks had a different relationship with the ecology than whites had. They mastered having this relationship. The whole concept of the Yoruba religion is to know and understand the forces of nature.
When you're trying to get free, it's very important to create your own identity. When you want to oppress somebody, the thing you do, you change their name, you change their religion, you change their language. And the Haitians understood that they needed their own language. This is why they speak the French Creole. That's a form of their own language. They knew that they had to go back to their own religion. They went back to voodoo, and there were people who were Catholic, there were people who were Christian, there were people who were different religions, but they went back to voodoo, and that codified everybody.
It was an African spiritual force that brought the people together. And when African people were brought together, it gave them a common goal. When they had a common goal, then they knew the common enemy, and then they would take care of their own business.
And voodoo is not just a religion. I mean, Africans didn't really have religions. They had a way of life that at best you can call their sacred science in dealing with cosmology and ecology.
Intentionality was to make our stuff so fearful and so evil and so scary that we run away from it, you know? And so all you gotta say is that, you know, when I was growing up, if I met a lady and I asked her where she's from, she said she's from Louisiana, I'd be backing out, oh, she might know voodoo. You know, she'll put something in my soup. She gonna do some people. See, that just make us afraid of our own stuff.
We ain't talking about no Dracula movies here, no zombies. We're basically talking about Africanism. We're talking about people that understand the strengths of plants and of nature and how to, you know, outwitty a militia by using what the gods have provided you on this earth.
So you call upon lowers to meet the task that you're confronted with. If you're engaging in war, you would call upon a lower that has the characters and qualities and dispositions of being warlike or strong and strength and fearless.
Dying was an opportunity to go back to the ancestors, to Guinea, right? So there was no fear.
Through science and through faith and through the will of not fearing death. Most Haitians don't fear death. They don't.
A lot of Haitians, they say don't fear death. So when you look at a lot of rappers now, a lot of rappers here in America, they will have Haitian gangsters in their entourages. And a lot of these dudes will have that Haitian muscle behind them. So this just shows the kind of respect and even fear that a lot of people still have for that Haitian rebel.
I mean, imagine if you're not scared of death, you're not going to be a good slave. And this is one of the reasons Christianity preached suicide is a sin. Yeah? One of the reasons that you get your reward. You get your reward in the afterlife, but only if you're a good slave.
It really is a science of the spirit. And that this voodoo that they demonized, the demonization of it was intentional because they wanted to separate us from the very thing that gave us power.
Let's be clear, a lot of African spiritual systems believed in what we call the transmigration of the soul. So they believe that the soul is eternal. This was very problematic for people you want to enslave. Again, coming back to before we even get to Haiti, in Africa itself, there are copious records among Europeans writing about slavery of Africans just jumping in the sea. I'd rather dead than be a slave. Consistent. And particular groups, so the Igbo of Nigeria, who are a group that very much believed in the transmigration of the soul, they were one of the groups that it's recorded by Europeans were most likely to commit suicide because they believed they'd be reborn in Africa. They believed that their soul lived forever, so I'd rather die than this stuff.
There is a cultural, spiritual unity that unites Africans and it gives them power. Even today in the African American community, it is the church that is the most powerful. And when anybody wants to sway the people, they always bring pastors in because they understand the pastors have the ear of the congregation and the people in the community.
We don't know shocking when you said rise of the dead when we talk about Jesus Christ. You know, if they say they can have Jesus rising, we can have my mama rising.
I had a heart attack some years ago, about 7 years ago, something called ventricular tachycardia. Heart beating too fast, it won't stop because I'm always doing stuff, you know. And they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. So finally they came one morning and said, Mr. Small, we're going to bring in the electricians. So I said, you know, y'all full of joke. He said, oh no, we're going to bring in the electricians. Because they have doctors who are human electricians. And their job is to measure the electrical current that goes from your brain to your heart and to your other organs, and to look at the relationship to the electrical current in your body and how much is it being interfered with from things outside of your body. Does that sound like voodoo to you? So that's what voodoo is talking about. And while on one hand we deny it when we talk about voodoo, but here in our highest science, it is proven to be reality.
So the Africans had absolutely no fear because they knew that this was a transformation, that it is how you live that matters, not how you die.
The concept of zombies comes from voodoo. It's an African concept. And it's not about the living dead, it's about worshiping the ancestors, praising the ancestors. But the white supremacists, they flip that into something demonic where people are going to come out the ground and walk around and get you. And that's that boogeyman concept that they've created because of the Haitians rising up and getting revenge. And that's always been a scary thing for the white supremacists. African people rising up, getting revenge on them. That's the zombie mentality that they've created because that's their fear. When you look at the old zombie movies back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, they would actually use Africans and Haitians as zombies.
And out of their West Indian island comes a tale of terror and voodoo, of witchcraft and zombies, and all the weird black magic that the white man seldom sees.
All of those old zombie movies had voodoo themes, so they were very open about it then.
You see, the thing about Dutty Boukman was he was so intelligent, he knew that he might not get it, because he did get captured and he was executed. But the revolution continued with the people. And that's another lesson I learned about the Haitian Revolution. It wasn't so much the leaders, it was the people. The people never gave up the spirit. To this very day, they still have the spirit.
Boukman is known for 3 or 4 things. Number 1 is the Boukman's prayer. You know, the God who created the earth, who created the sun that gives us light, the God that watches us from the clouds, the God that holds up the ocean. Our God has seen what the white man has done to us. Our God wants us to do good. The God of the white man wants him to do crimes. It's our God who will give us the strength and the courage to beat this white man.
So now this is the man who's going to rise from this. This thing is going to rise and say to us on August 14, 1791, the God who created the world, who make the waves move in the ocean, he is your Father. He is with you and will give you his strength. But you must act and free yourself.
Dutty Boukman is very intelligent. He is one of the leaders of the African people. He's very respected. And what he's going to do is he's going to devise a plan. And he is going to incorporate the ceremony of Ogun, the god of war. And he is going to assemble the forces. And he is going to instill in them a spirit of revolution.
And the last sentence is a pretty long thing. And the last sentence he says, listen to the voice of freedom. It speaks in each one of your hearts. When they ask him, but who will lead us in this battle? He says, the leader is inside you. You are the general and you are the soldier. Now get to it.
He comes from the form of just total understanding of what war is. There is no conceptual framework of peace. You don't call on Ogun for peace. You don't call on him for negotiation. You call on him when everything has been done that you've tried to do. You've been as diplomatic as you possibly can. But now it's time to get busy.
I have not seen anywhere where there's some text in voodoo that says, forgive and forget.
Black people and African people globally, we have this Jedi mind trick that's ran on us by the white supremacists where they can mistreat, subjugate, maldistribute the resources, harm, and oppress, and then tell us we should forgive them because this passage in the Bible says so. And that's a trick that African people have been falling for a long time. And the Haitian people, they didn't fall for that. They went to their old spiritual system. They went to African spiritual systems. They went to the voodoo. And in voodoo, there is no concept of forgiveness. And that's the thing that scared the white supremacists. And we got to stop falling for their mind tricks when they harm and oppress us and then tell us to forgive them. We got to start thinking in terms of our African spiritual systems and in terms of survival.
So we meet in those different places in the forest. And one question has to be debated. What can we do so our children and our grandchildren do not have to suffer what we're suffering here? And this is the night the decision was taken. There is no two ways. This man only understands force. So only with force can we talk back to him. And some people started saying, well, but we don't have boats, we don't have guns, we don't have this, we don't have that. And one of the answers that was given is God has never created a creature and not give you a way to fight. You sit on a stone, it is a tool while it's holding your body. But when you are attacked, you have your weapon under your butt. Use it.
When it comes to guerrilla warfare, and this is what the Haitian Revolution is a lesson in, we have to understand how guerrilla warfare works. When you're going up against a superpower, you can't go head up. You have to attack the flanks. You have to attack from the back. And you have to learn how to weaponize everything. So the Haitians, they learned how to weaponize nature, weaponize rocks, weaponize trees, weaponize animals. Understand that, because when they had the first voodoo ceremony, they had that in an alligator swamp. Now, they knew that the white supremacists weren't going to no alligator swamp, but they were just so in touch with nature, they knew they needed to weaponize everything.
Once you get to the point where you're going to do this, what you're actually doing is you are bringing the God of war within you. And every one of us as human beings has the God of war in us. We many times tried to keep it down.
The War Council was August 14th. They decided the revolution would start a week from there. A lot of those Africans did not speak the same language. They all came from different spaces, and a lot of them didn't know how to count. When would the revolution? So each were given, this is another, I do this also, each were given 7 stones, everybody at Bois-Caïma. And then they went back to their spaces, the plantation. Every morning, they were supposed to let one go. When there was no more stones in your hand, then coupe-tête boulikai, burn it all down.
Pat Robertson said that the devil was conjured up by the Haitians, and they had a devil-worshiping ceremony, and the devil killed all the French and killed all the whites on the island, which is a lie, by the way. They did not kill all the white people on the island. That's another big propaganda lie that they like to promote.
Something happened a long time ago in Haiti, and people may not want to talk about it. They were under the heel of the French. You know, Napoleon III and whatever. And they got together and swore a pact to the devil. They said, we will serve you if you'll get us free from the French. It's a true story. And so the devil said, okay, it's a deal. And they kicked the French out. You know, the Haitians revolted and got themselves free. But ever since, they have been cursed by one thing after the other, desperately poor.
Pat Robertson said that Satan came up, killed all the white people, and the Haitians have been cursed ever since. And that just shows how racially insecure do you have to be. You would rather give props to Satan. You would rather give credit to Satan than a group of African people who really put in the work and got rid of the French.
The night originally chosen to start the Haitian Revolution, so we remember the Haitian Revolution, August the 22nd, August the 23rd, right? The original plan was to start on the 24th. The reason the 24th was chosen was because on the 25th, the entire government was meeting the next day. So the ambition from the beginning was to kill the entire government and take over the island. The only reason the revolution had to start earlier, the rebellion had to start earlier, was because on the 21st, somebody struck early. And slave masters captured someone, tortured someone, and were warned that there was a rebellion coming. So they decided to strike early.
It's like asking the question, how did the Vietnamese defeat the reigning superpower of the United States of America? And part of that answer rests with the question of guerrilla warfare. That is to say, trying to avoid, whenever necessary, face-to-face confrontations of one military brigade facing another military brigade, but harassing the invading forces, who after all oftentimes are not very familiar with the geography.
So there was a dinner that happened a week before the Bois-Caïma ceremony, and actually it's now, scholars say, that's where the rebellion was planned. So it wasn't like they planned it on the spur of the moment on the night of the 22nd. The main leaders sat down and planned a week before, maybe months before that, had their dinner. The crazy part about it is that the Europeans knew that their privileged slaves were meeting for dinner, and they didn't think anything of it. They were so utterly convinced that black people were never going to do anything about their situation, could never overthrow them. They could never be defeated by a bunch of lazy, backwards, niggers from Africa, that they got complacent.
How to be able to create bamboo, knives, how to have blow darts. You know, all of these things they used against these forces because these forces could not fight a guerrilla-type warfare.
So with the martial arts and the idea of the fighting, whether if we're talking about Brazil, capoeira, or the motions of if we go to a voodoo ceremony and you see how they work with spears in different ways, or we go to the Amazons and you see how it's applied. It's the philosophy, the genesis of it all is a form of worship where even if the slave master comes, it more looks like it's a celebration of parties and different things going on, so it's not intimidating. But at the same time, it forms a form of martial arts, a form of self-defense, where when it's time to rise for the revolution, the masters didn't even know that you was already training a bunch of troops and now you're ready to go.
Bookman wore on the colony and occupied more than a third of the colony. Every activity was stopped. Everybody had only one thing: find Bookman and stop this. And we had no weapons. They had the guns. They had the cannons. They had everything. And yet, the fear.
So Bookman, one of the great leaders, he was eventually captured, he was eventually killed. And when they got Bookman, they wanted to make an example out of Bookman so they could scare all the other people from rebelling. So the legend was they got Bookman's head, decapitated him, and put his head on a stick and put it out in the public so that everybody could see it as a way to scare them. But at this point, people got rid of that fear of dying. So the rumor was people would walk past the head, see the head and say, they would rub their head and say, we're going to carry on the revolution.
One of the fascinating things about the Haitian Revolution is how little pride human beings outside the African diaspora have taken in it, which is fascinating to me, because this is an event of universal human significance, the only successful slave revolution in the whole history of humanity. In all the millennia of slavery, they've been from Greece to Rome to the Ottomans to the Abbasids. No one's ever had a successful slave revolution.
The next Haitian leader who would take the revolution to the next level was the great Toussaint Louverture.
He was raised by a woman from Dahomey. A lot of our people who were born here learned to speak different African languages and got the history of the places that whoever was teaching them came from. Toussaint might not have been from Dahomey, but being that the African woman who adopted him here was from Dahomey, then he's trained and raised as a Dahomean.
If you come from Africa, you have a militaristic aspect to your environment. Dahomey, as we know today, Benin, was one of the most warlike culture. That's where we get the term Amazon women, Amazon warriors, because of the women warriors of Dahomey. On television, they make you think Amazon women will come from someplace else. But these are you go to Benin and you can go to the museum and see statues of these women and so forth, these women warriors.
Toussaint is born on May 20th, has a very different, even in slavery, their experience is very different. He was a submissive person in slavery. He had slavers who kind of like him.
It was believed that Toussaint Louverture had been free from the age of 45. We now know he was free from about the age of 30. So he'd been a free, privileged African, if you like, in as much as that can be the case in a slave society, for quite a long time before the revolution. He was heavily Christian. He could read and write. He was very Europeanized. And in many ways, that determined his leadership, his experience of slavery, which was said to be, say, less harsh than someone like Dessalines, and his being free for so long. He constantly tried to placate or make peace with France.
Toussaint was an enslaved African who became a free African at some point in the process. I don't know whether he bought his way out of freedom or was granted manumission, because all of the slave societies seem to have put in place some process of manumission for the enslaved persons. And so he became a member of the French military, and he was the first African to become a general in the French military.
He became a great general, but what he's noted for is that before he even went into fighting, he made sure that his enslavers were off to America, okay, because he didn't kill them. And he always really had an affinity for the French.
He was operating in very difficult circumstances. I mean, it's not as if black people in Haiti had natural allies in the hemisphere. They had antagonists in the hemisphere. With regard to Cuba, which was controlled by the Spanish, that was an antagonist. With regard to Jamaica, controlled by the British, that was an antagonist. Of course, the United States was not altogether friendly. And then, of course, there was the French. And so he was maneuvering, aligning with one power against another power.
In 1802, Napoleon sent one of his generals, Charles Leclerc, over to Haiti so that he could try to bribe Toussaint into turning on some of the other Haitian leaders.
Early on in May 1802, he's speaking to Toussaint. He sent for Toussaint. Toussaint came, and in the room there were 2 chairs, a table. On that table, 1 million francs. And he said to Toussaint, "This money is yours." And Toussaint said, "Well, what do I have to do for it?" He says, "Nothing. Just bring me Dessalines' head." Toussaint put both his arms on the money, and he says, "If it is Dessalines' head that you want, you may as well cut both my arms right now."
He also develops a mindset that I'm respected as a French successful soldier. And so it was to his detriment that he thought that the military relationship that the French had for French soldiers would allow him to survive their imprisonment. And they don't apply that military standard to African peoples.
Napoleon understood that Toussaint wanted to get that respect from the French. Toussaint really wanted that respect. Toussaint really wanted to be accepted by the French military. Toussaint wanted to be accepted by the French elite class. And Napoleon saw that, and Napoleon played on that.
So then little by little, Toussaint became the top guy here, period, militarily and politically. And that's when he's going to do a constitution. He's going to have a constitution written and ban slavery. Of course, that was what brought his demise too. At that point, when Napoleon received the constitution that Toussaint produced here, he is vexed to the last degree and decide that Toussaint must die.
So Napoleon wrote letters to Toussaint inviting him to come over to France so they can negotiate, so they can talk. Napoleon stepped to Toussaint like, "We're the same. We're French generals. We're French military men. We're French." And Toussaint fell for that, and when Toussaint went over there, they captured him, put him in jail, and he died in jail. Now, Dessalines would not fall for that trick. He knew how brutal the white supremacists were.
And of course, you know the sad story of his end, how he goes thinking that he's going to negotiate with his French antagonists, and they arrest him and bundle him off to Europe, where he dies, and where, of course, he utters the immortal words that his death will not stop the revolutionary process. And in fact, he was correct, because it's carried on.
In the course of fighting Leclerc, who was the brother-in-law of Napoleon, who had come down to head one of the armies, Toussaint get captured. I think this is 1803 or 1802, 1803. And then he's taken to France, where he's really starved to death. They said he died of maybe tuberculosis. They starved him to death. And that's when Dessalines assumed the leadership of the army. At this point, the whites, who had now been given a kind of a republican freedom, wants the black folks to go back to the plantation, go back to your status quo. And Dessalines said that's not happening.
So Napoleon is known for exclaiming that it wasn't so much the economic adventure. He said we have to stop the forward movement of blacks in the world. Because remember, when he got into Egypt, and Count Volney wrote his book, Ruins of Empires, telling the French and telling the world, the very same people that we are enslaving and at war with in Haiti and Martinique and St. Lucia and Tobago are the very descendants of the people who built the pyramids that we are copying all their work.
Sent his brother-in-law Leclerc with the new expedition in February 1802 with a clear mission: capture the 10 black generals, send them to France. And once you do that, you could slaughter the entire population of blacks on the island. Don't worry, Africa still has plenty. We'll go back and get more.
Jean-Jacques, at the end of the day, he didn't like the idea of like Toussaint going to France, you know what I mean? It was like, yo, I'm telling you, this is not gonna work out. But in the dungeon though, Toussaint always says something, and they teach us this at a young age. And these are not the exact words, but this is the meaning of it. It's basically, I'm in this dungeon, you could do whatever you want with me, but the seeds already have been planted.
Rochambeau was a French military general, famous even by the standards of 18th century slavery for his incredible brutality. So when the French realized they cannot win back the island from these rebellious Africans, they decided to embark on a war of extermination. That was the official command: just exterminate them and we'll replace them with new Africans. So to that end, Rochambeau was tasked with that extermination.
When we think about people being gassed as a form of genocide, the first thing we think about is Nazi Germany. But the first gassing did not happen in Nazi Germany. The first gassing happened in Haiti because the French knew that there was natural sulfur on the island of Haiti. So they got the sulfur. When you burn sulfur, it becomes poisonous. So during the fight, the French put thousands of Africans on ships off the shore, locked them in, and burned the sulfur, and the gases and the fumes killed thousands of people.
Most wicked, vicious, atrocious thing that ever walked on this island. If you wrote a book of 1,000 pages, you couldn't tell all the atrocities that this man performed here, and with pleasure.
Rochambeau, French general, very well respected, very evil, very demonic with the tactics that he used. Napoleon sent him over to Haiti to carry out the genocide campaign. The thing about Rochambeau, Rochambeau not only disliked black people, Rochambeau disliked all the mulattoes too. He hated the mulattoes even more than he hated the blacks. So Rochambeau was a real piece of work.
He came into that port and he didn't reveal what he was going to do. And the people were really, really scared. And they held a festival for him. And it was a couple of days later when they were starting to feel, okay, this guy is not as bad as people have been saying, right? Then he invites them to this ball.
When Rochambeau came to the island, a lot of people didn't know what Rochambeau's agenda was. Nobody really knew anything about him at the time. So when he got to the island, people were kind of sitting back watching to see what he was going to do. So Rochambeau announced that he's going to have a ball, this big party, this grand gala, for all the wives of the mulatto soldiers. So at this ball, at this gala, they have this big, luxurious party where they're wining and dining the mulatto free women. You know, they got drinks, they got music, they got food. They're really partying and living it up. The French generals are there, the mulatto women are there, everybody's just mingling, having a good time. So Rochambeau makes an announcement that he wants to have the women follow him in another room in the house. So he walks down the hallway with the women following him. The women are just, you know, going along with the vibe, going along with the program, going along with the party. They don't know what's happening. They're still giddy, laughing, giggling. Once they get in this other room, Rochambeau announces to the women, hey, I got presents for all of you. So there are these boxes lined up. And there's different variations of this story, but this is the most popular one. So Rochambeau has all of these boxes of presents lined up for the women. So the women are, you know, they're still in a festive party mood, but now they're confused. So they see these boxes and they see Rochambeau announcing that he's giving them gifts. So the women are like, okay, cool. So the women get the boxes, and when they open the boxes, they look inside and they see the decapitated heads of their husbands inside the boxes. So the women are terrified. Rochambeau's standing there laughing, giggling, just laughing his head off, because he's letting them know, I don't care about the blacks or you mulattoes, and this is what I'm going to do to all of you while I'm here. That move there made the mulattoes and the blacks come together as a unit against the French.
On the island of Cuba, for some historically unique reason, these dogs had been bred to chase down Africans. And in fact, some of those dogs were imported to North America to chase down Africans. And some of those dogs wound up in Hispaniola to chase down Africans.
And these are the dogs they would send out to chase down black people whose only meal was the flesh of black human beings.
Because one of the things European pseudo-historians have done is, one, said that the enslaved Africans massacred all the white people left on the island at the revolution, at the end of the revolution, which they did not. They massacred all the French, but the whites who fought with them, the Polish and the Germans, as it says expressly in the 1805 Constitution, were not only not killed, were now classified as black people. They killed all of the French left on the island, 4,000 or 5,000 people. But these are the same French who just embarked on a war of extermination against them. And remember, there were still French troops on the island. They were just on the other half of the island, what now is the Dominican Republic. So it's not like France stopped posing a threat the moment they got their independence. In fact, not only were French troops in the other half of the island, they were agitating in the other half of the island. So this is the context in which that massacre takes place.
That's basically what the Haitian Revolution was about. Africans dying bravely, whether it was getting boiled, whether it was drowning, gas, shot, beheaded, burnt at the stake.
We had a culture where swording, fencing was a part of our culture. Lancing, using lances, was a part of our culture. Going back even to South Africa with the Zulu nation, when Shaka took a long lance and created this short lance, he created both a spear and a sword. And so that's a part of African culture, going all the way back to ancient Egypt.
A lot of them had military training in African traditions, people freshly arrived from Africa. And then they had the military training of fighting for their different colonial master against another colonial master. But a lot of the tactics they used were what today we'd call guerrilla warfare. They didn't fight in the way, they knew they couldn't defeat a European army of 20,000 people, 80,000 people. They've got much less sophisticated arms, they've got way more arms, etc. in a face-to-face European-style empire versus empire battle. So they used guerrilla warfare, they used raiding techniques.
Primarily, what you have is the people who know their ecology. If you've been to Haiti, Haiti has a terrain of hills and mountains and plateaus. And if you are the African, you live in that every day. You plant there, you till the grounds there, you hunt there. And so you master that terrain.
The sisters, in many ways, supplied the force, created the environment for the men to do what needed to be done. Sisters are very important to any revolution. In fact, ain't nobody having a revolution without women. In fact, if you think you're doing that, it's just a fight. It ain't a revolution.
Sonny Belair, for instance, when they caught her, her husband was General Charles Belair, right? And he negotiated for her release. And you know, these white settlers, they never, you know, they betray whatever. They have no honor, okay? So when he gave himself up, they took both of them, okay? So that's Sonny Belair and Charles Belair, the general. And so they sentenced her to a beheading because she was a woman, and then they sent him to get shot. And she refused. She said, I will die the honorable way with my husband. They wanted to blindfold her, and she said, no, you don't need to blindfold me because I'm a woman.
When they ordered to take her head and put it under, they fought and fought with her and couldn't do it. And in the end, she gave the orders. Soldiers, position. Don't make me wait. Fire!
The Haitian leaders understood that it would not be conducive to them to try to get individual gains to the detriment of the collective society. So they were smart enough to understand, I'm not going to try to get little trinkets for myself while everybody else is suffering under this oppressive system. Enough of them understood that, because in any society you're going to have collaborators, but enough of them understood that we cannot collaborate with these white supremacists because it's not going to be beneficial to us collectively.
Yeah, the Haitian Revolution, the Africans are given a bad rep. These are people who were enslaved. As far as I'm concerned, if you want to own me and buy and sell my children, I'm well within my rights to do absolutely anything to get free from you. And I think all of us looking back 2 centuries hence can see that. If someone tried to sell your children, what would you do? You'd do anything you could do to stop them selling your children. And any self-respecting human would. Why should it be any different 2 centuries ago?
Toussaint Louverture opened the pathway for freedom and independence. But the man who doesn't get enough credit for bringing the revolution to victory is Jean-Jacques Dessalines.
Two different characters, 2 different people who handle things differently. 2 different spirits, I would say also. Because if we take it in our own worldview, in the Vodun worldview, when you analyze Toussaint, Toussaint is a Legba. Legba is the spirit that comes to open the way and trace the road. When you analyze Dessalines, Dessalines is an Ogu. That's the one who comes to make things happen by any means necessary.
But it's also really interesting how people like Jean-Jacques Dessalines become a military genius within the space of 10 or 15 years, with no formal military training in the way that we understand it. And that's one of the inexplicable things. But again, it comes down to human intelligence and the human capacity for genius and desire to be free.
Dessalines is definitely not Dahomey. I am certain of it. But it is a Dahomean woman who taught him Yoruba and taught him how to fight, how to do his Tantoya, who raised him. And not just any woman, it was a military woman, because Dahomey had 2 armies, a female army and a male army. And this woman was an officer in the female army of Dahomey when she was captured and brought into slavery. So she went right into work to raise some of the young ones that she, in a certain way, adopted. And Dessalines seemed to have been her prized.
Tantoya is significant because she taught the greatest hero to ever live how to do hand-to-hand combat when he was a teenager, how to shoot. She taught him everything he knew, because he was enslaved. But she had come from a warrior background.
I don't recall seeing anywhere where Toussaint was beaten, whereas Dessalines was constant. His entire back was whooped with scars that healed and hurt again and healed, and huge big blobs of scars all over his back.
And Dessalines, as opposed to Toussaint, did not have the love of the French military. He had a deep understanding of the European exploitation. He also had a deep understanding of the ruthlessness of the various European populations when they were taking out vengeance on the African population.
See, the difference between Toussaint and Dessalines, Toussaint wanted to make deals with the white supremacists. Toussaint felt he was a military man. He had some kind of camaraderie with the French. He felt that he could make deals. He was somewhat one of them. They would respect him as a military man. And that was his downfall. Now, Dessalines, he knew, and he's really the only modern African leader who understood that you cannot make deals with terrorists. You can't make deals with white supremacy. White supremacy is the ultimate form of terrorism. And Dessalines was the only person who was smart enough to realize that, and he got all the white supremacists off the island.
That's the story. So he was enslaved African. He was definitely beaten a lot. He ended up being bought by a free black man. So, those assimilated Negroes could do some good things if they want. His name was Jean-Baptiste Dessalines, the free black man who bought him and gave him his freedom. But Dessalines never forgot what slavery was about.
So what Dessalines did is, you buried alive 500 Africans, he hung 500 French. For everything that Rochambeau did, Dessalines did the same thing.
Add up all of those different characteristics, the topography, the geography, the guerrilla warfare, the use of arson, etc., you begin to understand how and why the Africans on the island were able to prevail.
At the end of the war, it was really bloody. And I think there was a point in time where Rochambeau had killed thousands, and he matched them, like head for head.
I mean, one of the raids I've learned about was a raid Dessalines undertook, where they raided a French camp with just machetes. Now imagine you're a heavily armed French camp, and a bunch of dudes walks into your camp with just machetes and chop you up. The level of bravery and arrogance almost that takes to go and face the French with just machetes.
The other piece to remember is you have St. Lucia, Tobago, and Martinique. Those are other 3 islands that the French are reinstating the enslavement process. And what the Haitian people are doing, and Dessalines are doing, is he's watching that and he's saying, look, it won't be long. If they can get those surrounding islands back where they were years ago, then they're going to come over here next. So Dessalines, he said straight out, he said, we are going to take care of these cannibals.
The British Army came here in 1801 with over 30,000 soldiers, and saying that it didn't want to waste too much time, wanted to do a rapid operation, and in less than a couple of weeks was going to take over the island. Well, he didn't know there was a man here called Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Toussaint Louverture was there too, but the main man on the ground was Dessalines. And sure enough, they had to leave on the ground. As they run back to their boats, they had to leave 25,000 troops on the ground. And that's the largest loss of the British Army in the entire America.
A lot of the Haitians came from places like Angola. When we think of Angola, we hear about capoeira. Capoeira is one of the fighting styles. Now, capoeira, people think that it's Brazilian. Capoeira is not Brazilian. As a matter of fact, the Portuguese banned capoeira from Brazil up until the 1930s because they didn't want those Africans using that, because the Africans were using that to free themselves in Brazil, beating the Portuguese. You had brothers like Zumbi, who was from Angola, and they were using the OG capoeira. The capoeira that we know now is watered down because it's based on an oral tradition, because they burned the books and the instruction manuals and got rid of those down in Brazil because they knew that Africans getting a hold of that knowledge, that was very dangerous. So a lot of those African fighting skills, like capoeira, these are old African systems that we transfer to each other, and many of the Haitians, they tap back into those fighting skills. Stick fighting, capoeira, different types of African martial arts, and these were the skills they used to beat the French off them.
The Haitians had a certain resilience about them, you know, where they applied science a lot of times, and science is very strong, you know, so there's powders that are created, and these powders are not gunpowders, but if you spit it in someone's face, there's ways to numb them. And this is all science.
So our brothers and sisters in Haiti had an understanding of nature where they used nature. They knew how to use weather. They knew how to use the trees to cover themselves, to hide themselves. And when all the forces would come in, they would come down on just brute force. The martial arts that they brought from Africa, the fighting systems that they brought from Africa, the ability to make weapons out of wood and stick.
Once again, you have this small island of black people with the population probably not exceeding 500,000 at its highest point. And it's surrounded by antagonists, not only in the Caribbean, but actually worldwide, in a sense, to the extent that European powers had their tentacles globally. And so this was not a time for a revolutionary leader of Africans to be pussyfooting around, shall we say.
Being a military is not just about weapons. It's much more. You have to be spiritually, you have to be a military. You have to know how to treat people. You have to learn how to heal, because you're going to hurt, you're going to kill. You must do to heal so it will balance your soul. So there are a lot of things involved in the training of Dessalines, but you have to be clear. And Dessalines was very clear that slavery was no child's play. And slavers didn't care for us, they care more for a stone on the ground than any breathing people that look like us.
They spared no one who was fighting against them, as any soldier should do. And so the Africans proved to be extraordinarily good swordsmen. They were extraordinary with using lances, or what we call spears, and they learned very quickly how to be extraordinary using a rifle. And so we defeated the French straight up and hands down.
One of the really interesting things when you examine the French testimony is the frustration that the French particularly had with this tactic. They complain about it, they call it cowardice or whatever else, but then in other places, when the time was right, you hear French soldiers talking about a guy jumped down the cannon today, and these are the people we have to fight. The sheer terror of, like, we're fighting people who've decided now liberty or death. They've decided they are willing to die for their freedom. And this is one of the most fascinating questions about any revolution, but about the Haitian Revolution in particular. What makes people decide at this point, we're now willing to die for an idea, but we weren't yesterday? And you see this behavior. You see people being burnt and tortured, laughing at it. You see people recklessly risking their life. Battle of Vertier, if you look at the French testimony of that final battle, the African behavior in that battle, we would say, was so militarily reckless, i.e. they were so willing to die for their freedom, that the French stopped the battle in the middle to congratulate them and say, listen, we've never seen people die like this.
By the time Dessalines rises, circa 1803, circa 1804, the revolution is pretty far down the road, and he had learned the lessons that had ensnared Toussaint and was not about to be arrested and detained by supposed negotiators in good faith.
Not only were women very active, there are lots of children active in the fight. Children who made their names. And, you know, as looking out for, climbing on top of trees to look out for what's happening and alerting.
Most Africans who was fighting in Haiti were like first, at most, second generation from Africa. So they still had the African martial arts skills as a part of their repertoire in terms of fighting.
And then, of course, there are other kinds of tactics. Arson was very successful. Of course, arson was very successfully used by the enslaved Africans in North America as well. That was one of the major tools in our toolkit right here in North America. And at a certain point, the European colonizers had to make a judgment as to whether or not it was worthwhile to continue to endure losses, that is to say, deaths, in trying to subdue these revolutionaries, when it's not clear that even if you did triumph, you would inherit a charred and burned landscape.
Bonaparte sends this huge armada, thinking, we're going to get rid of these people, right? But they try to use ruse. That's the other thing. The Haitians really knew how to use ruse, right? They would do all kinds of things, like keep changing their clothes and going around to make as if they had more people than they had, stuff like that. Or, you know, the Europeans loved, you know, sleeping with black women or whatever. They never thought that these black women would go back and tell the African warriors what was going on. They used everything that was in their hands.
Napoleon's campaign against the Haitians, it was a racial agenda. Napoleon specifically stated that he did not want a black republic. We cannot have a black republic. This thing was completely racial.
French writers, a lot of French writers were like, there must be some white person behind this. It's the abolitionists' fault. It's this person's fault. It's those guys who stirred up something else. There was this constant blaming of so-called white agitators.
Dessalines Toussaint, they didn't kill every white person on the island. That's a misconception. We were in war, and we were slaves. And within this slave, we had to fight for our independence. And in this process, you still had certain whites that were with the Haitians.
And so they create this model constitution, but they apply it to the circumstance of Haiti. So they say no plantations can exist. No white folks can own land. But they realize that all white folks are not the same, and so they have a special compensation for Polish white folks who joined their revolution and helped them to defeat the French.
At the end of the war, once the victory against France had happened, what Dessalines said to them, that because of the horrific genocide you've meted out against my people, you've got to go. You can't stay. He accepted their surrender. 7,000 of them surrendered and was pulled out of the country and went back home. The officers under Rochambeau and the others, who he got a ship for them, fully equipped the ship, and let them go home free. But his request was, all of you go home, okay? Can't stay here. The only people that can stay is the Italians and the Polish who fought with us, and the Germans who did not lift any arms against us.
After trying everything and couldn't manage, couldn't get off the island, so then he had to come in front of Dessalines. And according to his own journal, he said, Dessalines was magnanimous. He complimented him. He said, you're a good soldier, even if you've lost. They're supposed to give their sword to the winner. He says, no, keep your sword. You're a good soldier. I don't need your sword. I got my own. And so he's, what are you going to do to me? He says, nothing. I'm going to send you back to France. And your task will be to let them know never to set foot on this island again.
What's really significant about this, Salim, is that Rochambeau told everybody, I'm going to get that Negro, I'm going to do all kinds of heinous things to him. But when we won, when the Haitians won at Vertières on November 18th, 1803, he didn't kill Rochambeau. He let him go. And I think that's really significant.
And even those who got on the ship and went out with Rochambeau, you know what they did as soon as they got far out at sea? They turned the cannons on Port-au-Prince and opened fire on the very people that had just given them their freedom. But as fate would have it, they ran into some conflict with the British fleet a few days, 8 days out, and he ended up spending 2 years in a British prison, or longer.
Dessalines obviously did kill a lot of white folks, especially the French, right? I think there was like 50,000 soldiers that came to re-enslave us, and 7,000 left alive.
And this is really interesting, the way that European imagery of black people came back to haunt them. These big black guys from Africa who've been laboring for you for decades and decades and decades, whose physical brute power and force you've depended on in terms of breeding them and all this. And now they got a machete in their hand. That brute force, that same imagery, sexualized graphic imagery you've created around the black body has come back to haunt you, because now it's aimed at you.
Modern historians, when they talk about Napoleon, they talk about how thorough he was as a general. They talk about his great military mind, the strategies he used. They just ooze and gush and praise Napoleon for being the greatest general. And the thing about Napoleon was defeated by Dessalines. So if your greatest general was defeated by Dessalines, that means Dessalines is the greatest general.
Marcus Mosiah Garvey spoke frequently on the Haitian Revolution and the lessons that we could learn from them. And the one lesson is, it ain't over till we win. The Irritated Genie, a book that I read, phenomenal book by Dr. Jacob Carruthers. It's called The Irritated Genie. That irritated genie is the spirit of revolution at all costs. Take no prisoners. We have no friends. It's up to us to make this happen. Then you have the Phantom of Liberty. The Phantom of Liberty is the philosophy that you believe that you can negotiate with your enemy, that you can integrate with your enemy, that your enemy wants to be your friend, if you could just sit down and talk. And Dessalines was more of an irritated genie.
What's most fascinating about Dessalines, and probably the most under-discussed part of Dessalines' leadership, is that Dessalines attempted, long before the birth of Karl Marx, forms of proto-socialism, if you like, when he governed the island. So he attempted to nationalize all of the land that was formerly owned by the French, which was 75% of the arable land in the country, and spread it amongst the peasants. He was on record as saying, listen, we didn't win this war, i.e. we, the privileged leadership, we won the war. All of us, the peasant population, the enslaved population, and he tried to bring about some form of economic justice in the brief period that he governed, and in my view and in lots of people's view, that was why he was killed by the other free people of color.
On January 1st, 1804, he declared Haiti independence. And the first sentence of our first constitution says, Haiti is independent from all powers of the universe.
Haiti liberated 5 South American nations, you know, from Venezuela, Colombia, all the way down. We liberated also the entire island, right? The Dominican Republic didn't exist.
Not only did Haiti get their own freedom, and this is what was so dangerous to the white supremacists, Haiti helped other Latin American nations get rid of slavery. Like Ecuador, it stopped slavery in Ecuador. They helped them get rid of slavery. They helped Venezuela get rid of slavery. They helped the Dominican Republic get rid of slavery. So that was a big fear of all the other Western powers, that this nation of African warriors were stopping slavery all over the hemisphere. So this is why even today they have to subjugate Haiti.
When Miranda came from Ecuador, he was trying to come out of slavery, and he had lots of problems. The U.S. was giving him trouble. He came here. Dessalines welcomed him. He had people wounded with him. We healed them, gave them boat, money, weapons, and sent them back to continue their work. When he asked Dessalines, but how will I repay you? He says, every time you free people out of slavery, I am repaid.
The leading hero of Venezuela, Simón Bolívar, of course, received direct assistance from the Haitian revolutionaries. And of course, once again, this illustrates the debt we owe to Haiti, because part of the bargain was that the South American revolutionaries would move to abolish slavery. Sometimes that promise was kept, sometimes that promise was not kept, but that was the bargain that the Haitians tried to strike.
Years immediately after the revolution start to scare the white world, and they don't know what to do with Haiti, because they're like, if this infection spreads and it's proven that, you know, black people might actually be capable of government, what happens to all of the other former slave colonies in which blacks are the majority? What happens in Brazil? What happens in Jamaica and elsewhere? So it was a decision was made by most governments, like America, for example, not to recognize Haiti until they eventually abolished slavery themselves.
So 60 years, Haiti was not allowed to have a merchant marine to trade. And if you're a nation and you can't trade, you are impoverished.
During the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution after 1804, there was a lot of sabotage by the mulatto class, because the only thing that's worse than a white supremacist is a wannabe white supremacist. And the wannabe white supremacists are the worst, because they're fighting for something that they really can't be. So they'll sabotage anything for a fantasy, and that's what they did after the Haitian Revolution.
It's obvious that the Catholic Church and the French conspired to kill Dessalines with probably the help of the Americans and the British. And so Dessalines was assassinated. He went to meet someone. No one knew who this was. They cut his body up, I was told, into 13 or 14 pieces and scattered around the island. But that's where the women come in. Again, his wife Felicite, Cecilia, and other women got together and gathered up all those pieces, put that body back together in the manner that it was done to Osiris in the myth in ancient Kemet, and they buried him.
Napoleon was so powerful that he intended to take over the 13 states. He sent 2 units, one to the Louisiana Territory and one to Haiti. His intention was to attack the United States and take over. But because he had to use the units he had put into Louisiana to Haiti, when Haiti became independent, remember that trade had stopped because of the Haitian Revolution.
Then Christophe took over the northern part of Haiti, while Pétion took over the southern part of Haiti. Pétion set up a sort of a republic. Christophe made himself king, or was elected king over the northern area. It is Christophe that built this extraordinary citadel, the largest such edifice in the Western Hemisphere. No one has done anything like this.
But if you look at the citadel in Haiti, or Sans-Souci, or any of the other military governmental fortifications built in the time, and you imagine this as a society run and governed by people who were slaves into the middle of their adult life.
A citadel, a huge structure, the largest structure in the Americas, ready to house over 20,000 people. This is conceived by Dessalines and executed by Henry Christophe, who became king down the road. He built it in 11 years. No help from the World Bank, no FMI, no Friends of Haiti, nobody. Self-resources from A to Z.
Is this big castle that's built on one of the highest mountains in Haiti, armed forces, cannons that are aimed at the ocean. And the idea of this was, we're not sure if the French is coming back. So we have to make sure that we know the waters, we know how they're coming, we know where they're gonna come from.
Haiti was making her own money. We made our own under Christophe. We made our own gold and silver coins. Better yet, we did it so well. Colombia, Venezuela, several other countries in South America asked us to make their money for them. Yes, we were minting.
You know, you had a major rebellion down in Louisiana in 1811. That was shortly after thousands of enslaved Haitians had been brought to Louisiana, because many of the white Frenchmen who didn't go back to France, over 10,000 of them fled to New Orleans. And they took with them the enslaved Africans that they had control over. And many of those slave Africans then led what was the biggest rebellion in the history of the United States.
The white slave masters flee in Haiti, French ones. A lot of them go to French Louisiana, and they strengthen the slave regime in the South. They make slavery even more bedrock of Southern American culture. Remember, these are people who've seen what black revolution looks like in Haiti, and it was brutal. How are you going to get free of slavery without brutality? So they make the South of America a more concentratedly racist place.
Absolutely no one recognized Haiti's independence. That was number one. And though everybody was talking about freedom, liberty, democracy, everyone has the right to be happy. Oh, but not us.
I don't think they expected that the revolution would have had that kind of massive victory. And once it happened, the fear was, if we recognize, this was Thomas Jefferson who's in office at the time, if we recognize Haiti as a free republic, then what are we going to do about all of the enslaved Africans in North America? So we have to reject it and now go into an economic boycott of it, similar to what they did to Cuba in modern times.
That's their stuff, right? They have this either or. Either I'm going to be it, I can't be it if you're it. See, African thought says everybody can be it. But the European mindset is that I can only be it if you are not it.
What happened to Haiti, though, was the tax that the French put on it, the reparation tax. So that's sort of like, so okay, we'll give you independence, but now this is going to cost you, right? So we'll give it to you, but we'll pull your economic freedom from you.
And there are all kinds of economic exploitations that have been put onto Haiti since the pigs from America were put into Haiti to overtake their Haitian pig farming. Foreign grain was imported into Haiti. Sweatshops have been set up. I mean, there are reams and reams of books for people who are bothered that can go out and read on why Haiti is in the condition that it's in today. And it's largely due, partly, to a local parasitic, greedy elite, but mostly due to foreign exploitation. Without that foreign exploitation, the elite would not be in the position to be able to do the things that they have been and currently are still doing in Haiti.
So this also put a big fear in America's heart, that Haiti had the ability, right after that revolution, to send troops to South America to help free those South American nations from Spain. Then they were worried about the African American nation here. especially when you had a large population of Africans in Florida that was still under the control of Spain. Florida was the biggest maroon community in the Western Hemisphere, but we don't refer to Florida as a maroon community because American history has falsely said that the people they were fighting were a group of Indians called Seminoles, and don't tell you that that word they corrupt to be Seminoles come from the Spanish word of Cimarron, which means runaways. And so these are the runaway Africans. And so when Andrew Jackson was sent down there after he did the Mexican-American War, to fight these people, he sent a letter back to Congress, and in the letter he says, "You sent me to fight Indians, but I've been fighting niggers from the day I got here." You know, and this is a letter that's still in the Library of Congress.
DuSable, this brother was the founder of Chicago, and he was a brother of Haitian descent. Brother spoke different languages, so he was the first person to understand the strategic location of Chicago and how that can be used, because in Chicago, he could speak so many different languages. He could deal with the Spanish in the West, he could deal with the French in the South, he could deal with the English on the East, he could deal with the Native Americans in the North. So that was a very strategic place, and he was the first person to go there and monetize that area. And what's interesting about DuSable, many people thought that he was a spy for Haiti, because many people were shook about what happened during the Haitian Revolution. An African slave population rising up and overthrowing their oppressor. That sent chills all through white society.
The Haitian leadership in the 1820s had to make a decision. Should they go into debt and possibly deform the revolutionary process for decades to come by paying the government of Paris for the alleged losses suffered by slave owners, or should they not make the payment and run the risk of being invaded and having all of the citizenry enslaved? Those were the stark choices faced by the leadership, and they chose the former. That is to say, to make this payment.
I think it's like 1825, Charles X sent the fleet to invade the islands and retake it. And the compromise was, you pay us 100 million francs, 150 million francs, which was reduced some years later to 93 million francs. And that's how that came about. And they said, you're paying us this for the land that you've taken from us, from the enslaved Africans who was working for us that you've taken from us, and the resources the land was producing for the French Republic. And so that's where that 150, which wasn't paid off until very recently, which kept the Haitian economy in a tither for the entire period of its history.
So we are a country that is being continually raped at every level, every time. If it's not an occupation, and anytime you see an occupation, you can be sure they do not occupy a country that has nothing.
I see a lot of similarities between Haiti and Detroit, because Detroit was the land of some of the most phenomenal movements of black people ever in the world. Marcus Garvey had a strong movement in Detroit. The Honorable Noble Drew Ali developed the strongest contingent and temple in Detroit. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad was a student of Marcus Garvey and Noble Drew Ali in Detroit. Malcolm X moved to Detroit to be close to Elijah Muhammad. And then, of course, you have the Motown sound. You have the voice of black people worldwide. And I think that what's happening in Detroit is very much like that. At all costs, Detroit must be purged of its power.
The Marines came in and they were responsible for the death of close to 4,000 to 5,000 Haitian citizens. And the occupation lasted something like 20 years. And when they came in, what they did was seize control of all of the finances, all of the banks, and all the wealth of Haiti. And the money, Haiti's monies from his bank and his wealth was brought to America and transferred down to banks in New York. That wealth had never been returned to Haiti.
The first time the Citadel is attacked is during the U.S. occupation of Haiti in 1915. The U.S. Army stood up every day for 90 days and shoot at it while there's nobody in it.
But even then, America was fully now vested and in control of the Haitian economy, And during that occupation of the American Marines, they rewrote the Haitian Constitution. Until then, part of Dessalines' Constitution was that no land could be sold or owned by any foreign persons. Land could only be owned by Haitians of blood. Even a Haitian who had left home could no longer own land. And so what America did was change the Constitution so that Americans could buy land, and they began to buy up or seize some of the best farmland and mining lands in Haiti, and that's still true to today.
The mountains that Christopher Columbus didn't have the technology to take the gold out of, they've got the technology to do now, and they are taking that out. They say we have 20 billion in gold.
And now Haiti is important because of its geographical location and its geology. There's oil and gas in abundance off of Haiti's shore. And so one of the reasons for the Clinton Foundations and these others to saturate Haiti is there's gold in them there hills, and there is oil off of those shores and beaches. And so Haiti is now under a new form of exploitation, which we are calling globalism.
The Clintons were put over, and their people who worked with and for their foundation, was put over managing the billions of dollars that came into Haiti for the rebuilding process. Well, they managed it back into their foundations and their bank accounts.
For the last 13 years in Haiti, the UN has been the cover for the Bushes and the Clintons to work together and extract the resources that we have. Haiti has $120 billion worth of oil.
The International Red Cross claims that they have received from people around the world $6 billion for the quake situation in 2010. Haiti never saw. We did not see 6 billion, we did not see 5 billion, we did not see 4 billion, we did not see 3, 2, or 1 billion. But somebody got the money.
The money is still controlled by the European. The education is still controlled. The institutional political structure is still controlled. And the spiritual structure is still controlled. That you have Africans in the French-speaking areas today who are readily prepared to say, je suis français, I'm French. And so that cultural dynamic of assimilation into French culture has helped cripple Africans.
Haiti is corrupted because 80% of a population, man, is living on less than $1 a day. It's corrupted because the lack of education. This is why this place is corrupted.
If you go to almost any store downtown and you get buy yourself a new suit, look inside and see where it was made. That suit was made in Haiti. Probably for, you're paying maybe $200, it was probably made for $25. The guy who made the suit may have made $1. Okay? And so, and part of that arrangement and contract that made, you can't unionize, you can't strike, and you can't ask for an increase in wage. Any of those can result in you losing your job or even going to jail.
Different times in our history, you will find that Haiti is forward in everything. In creating the OAU, the Haitians were the #1 people in doing all the papers and working, and when everything, the U.S. was not in it, they refused to be part of it. And when we were a couple of weeks away from the grand opening, U.S. stepped in with money, bought itself in, and demanded that Haiti be not part of it.
Because Wycliffe had put together a foundation that was being contributed to, and that money could not be controlled by them. That was one of the reasons, and the other reasons, they had already picked someone they wanted to put in the presidency that they can control, and they could not control the Wycliffe John.
If I was a politician, I would have been the president of Haiti. But the fact that I didn't go through the proper lobbying, the proper, you got to do a deal with this person, you got to make sure you get the blessing from this person, from that person, none of that happened. So it was almost like Wyclef Jean was a wild card. And a wild card is not accepted.
Which is very interesting because you have so many nonprofit organizations that rape Haiti that are white-run organizations, and they never talk about that corruption, but all of a sudden it's Wyclef and Yele, they're the most corrupt thing ever.
The intimidation factor of whatever anyone was trying, it did not work, you know? And if I'm sitting here and I was to tell you that, you know, I wasn't armed up, I would be lying to you. Because at the end of the day, I was in a position where I was ready to do whatever I had to do as a Haitian citizen to make sure that the power went to the right person that wasn't gonna oppress the people.
There's a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and the author talks about how the white supremacist Western powers will put black leaders, puppet leaders, into certain positions to do the bidding of Western powers. And when these African leaders stop doing the bidding for Western powers, they're usually assassinated. It's a white guy who wrote this book. And our brother Wyclef, big music star, the media loved him. The minute Wyclef wanted to run for president of Haiti, he's a man of the people, not corrupt, doesn't need the money. I mean, he's a very successful artist already, but he wants to do something for his people because he's from those people. The minute he wanted to run for president of Haiti, all of a sudden the media turned on Wyclef. They started putting negative stories out about our brother. They started talking about his Yele Foundation, talking about corruption.
Like Yele Haiti was a patsy and a distraction for a lot of what really went down in Haiti. While everyone was trying to make Yele Haiti look like there was this big organization, you know, with the big celebrity face, like, you know, because when you hear the Red Cross, there's no face that go with it. All you see is Red Cross. You know what I mean? Like, so when you hear Wyclef, you be like, yo, that's the Yele Haiti, that's the face.
And the minute Wyclef got back into the music game and just focused on music, everything was good again. So the whole Wyclef slander thing was to show him, don't step out of your place. And I don't believe any of the negative stories that they said about Wyclef. It was all propaganda, and it was propaganda for a reason, and we have to stop believing the white supremacists when they're trying to give us negative information on people within our communities.
Yele Haiti was a patsy for a bigger play. Because now that you rarely hear anyone say anything about Yele. The minute Clef goes back and starts to play guitar, does his music, and hits the billboard again, it's almost like, okay, nigga, you back in your place. This is what you're supposed to be doing, nigga. Don't forget, you're supposed to be singing. You're supposed to be making people dance. And when it comes to this thing in politics, or trying to be careful how you gonna move, right? But what don't kill you, right? It only make you stronger.
Jamaica's right next to Haiti. There were a lot of rebel leaders from Jamaica, like Bookman. He was a rebel leader in Haiti who was from Jamaica. So that spirit of revolution has always been interchangeable between the Haitians and the Jamaicans. So Garvey was definitely influenced by the Haitian Revolution and Dessalines. When you look at pictures of Marcus Garvey, many people will suggest that he's dressed like Dessalines. And Marcus Garvey has influenced so many movements that are modern now. He influenced the Nation of Islam. He influenced the Moorish Science Temple. He influenced Malcolm X. Malcolm X's father was a Garveyite. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of Vietnam, was a Garveyite. He studied at the feet of Marcus Garvey when Ho Chi Minh was in Harlem. And this is why Vietnam was able to use that spirit of revolution to fight off the European powers and remain independent on their own. They got that spirit through Garvey, who got that spirit through Dessalines, who got that spirit through the Haitian Revolution.
When you're in the vanguard, that means oftentimes you're the first to get the arrows in your chest. You're the first to be wounded and the first to bleed profusely. And that's the case for the Haitian revolutionary process. That is to say that they in some ways were sacrificial lambs for the rest of us. That is to say, by going up against the slave owners and inflicting this deadly blow on the slave system, they helped to liberate the rest of us. But in turn, they helped to injure themselves.
Whatever our ancestors did is only the best for them. What they expect from us is to add our victories to their victories and to keep going up higher and higher.
You cannot rebuild your society until you rebuild yourself. And you cannot rebuild yourself until you restore your spiritual, cultural, and historical integrity to the mindset that is about to carry out this building.
The month of August is very instrumental to melanated people. There's something about the month of August that electrifies our melanin, that gives us a certain sense of power. If you look at a lot of significant revolutions, they all happened in August. The Haitian Revolution happened in August. Jamaica got its independence in August. Look at modern times. The Watts riots was in August. Let's get even more modern. The Ferguson uprising was in August. I think Garvey's birthday is in August. So there's a lot of significant things that happen in the month of August as it relates to melanated people. And the Haitian Revolution was one of those things.
So we Haitians need a new movement. This movement is, how do you get Haitians in Haiti into economic freedom? How do you get them into education?
Why do you think the slavers go through so much effort for you not to know your history? Evidently. Because that's where all your references are. That's what gives you the measure as to what you can do.
But every place we see success in the African world, it was when Africans stood up and said, I'm going to be free and African. And so we did learn from Haiti. What were those moments when we were struggling to be free and African?
Many of the Western powers are still trying to sabotage Haiti to this very day. Recently, the UN had to apologize for putting cholera in the water over there. People are sending plastic rice over there to the people. They're sending plastic chicken. They're sabotaging the economy. And the fact that they have to make such a collaborative effort to sabotage the small island of African people, that just shows the innate power that the Haitians have.
The French Revolution was incredibly brutal, yet it's treated with respect in historiography as producing ideas that were influential for humanity. The Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, similar, all treated with respect. The Haitian Revolution, until very recently, I would argue the tide is changing, has been treated like some, just niggas in the Caribbean rebellion, when actually it is arguably the greatest challenge to the dominant global order, as I can't remember which scholar said that, in the entire last 200 years.
It's about capturing the light from what happened in the past, because that is the light that allows you to understand the present. And it is the same light that will show you the fastest and best way to a better tomorrow.
And if there is a nation that will rise through their character, it's going to be Haiti. These are a people who are experiencing something that they should not have to go through. But they're experiencing it, they're doing it with dignity and respect, and they're doing it showing us, all over the world, how people, in no matter what condition you're in, it ain't over till you win.
So the importance that what is good for the collective is the priority. It's not the individual. Individuals can come and go. But we must worry that either on the way we come or the way we go, we don't damage the collective.
During the revolution, enough people understood that rugged individualism, that one or two people getting little Negro trinkets from the white supremacists, it's just not worth sabotaging the collective efforts of the entire population. And they were smart enough to understand that, and I wish we are smart enough to understand that now.
So I think visiting Haiti, going and seeing our brothers and sisters on the ground, interacting there with community, all of these things are things that the global African diaspora and anyone interested in justice could and should be doing in terms of resurrecting an island that made an incomparable contribution to the modern world.
When we look at coverage of Haiti today, the Western media will try to scare us, black people, from going to Haiti. We're always told, don't go to Haiti, it's dangerous. When you get off the plane, you're going to get kidnapped. There's going to be a voodoo ceremony, something's going to happen to you. So black people are scared of going to Haiti to visit for the most part. When I go over there, there's white people all on the plane going over there. People going over there vacationing, because there's a lot of nice parts over there in Haiti. So we have to stop listening to the media telling us what to do and what not to do about Haiti. I didn't feel unsafe over there. The people were beautiful. The people were wonderful. Nobody's trying to bother anybody. These people are trying to survive, and I'm very inspired by the Haitian people.
We need to mobilize our forces as best we can to link up with Haiti. And one of the things that we could do to contribute to that is to encourage Haitians out of Haiti to Africanize.
When I look at Haiti, I look at a people with a spirit, with a power, with a spiritual system that will never disable them. The God that they pray to will always look out for them. And sometimes you got to go through that to get where you need to get.
I think that with this current Trump administration, this spells ill for the future of black people in the immediate sense in North America. And that as we try to help the Haitians, we should realize that we're also helping ourselves, because we, black Americans, need a global approach to our problems.
And to reach out to community-based organizations of Haitian descent that are assisting their people in any way that they possibly can, that can get it directly to the people and begin to develop those types of relationships.
The fortunate aspect of this Trump administration is that he is creating antagonists all over the world, not least south of the border of Mexico. I continue to be baffled and befuddled by the fact that black Americans have not been sending delegations and pilgrimages to Mexico City to forge alliances there, which in turn could be leveraged on behalf of our brothers and sisters in Haiti. I don't think it takes an oracle or a genius to figure out what needs to be done. I just think it requires courage.
My experiences with people from Haiti or Haiti, whether they are here or whether they are in Haiti, is that there is a resilience. There's a great dignity and a great pride in them. And I remember I've spoken to them before, and their power, their internal power, the power from within, their ability to commune, that idea of staying together and sticking together and looking out for each other is very powerful. And I think that people, they're misunderstanding them if they don't think that Haiti can rise.